Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I know it's Friday afternoon. It's towards the end of the conference, but I'm so excited that there are so many people who are interested to learn about emerging markets. I have a bunch of stats here about why emerging markets matter and how they're becoming leaders in energy transitions, but I'm going to skip over that in interest of time and introduce our two amazing speakers for today. So we're lucky to have Xixi Chen here with us from WRI. She is a senior research manager for energy at the Policy Center for Global Energy Transition, and she leads research and data analytics for creating financing solutions and resilient mineral supply chains that support transformative energy transition technologies. Before joining the World Resources Institute, she worked at the Environmental Defense Fund. She was focusing on initiating and strengthening corporate partnerships to develop sustainability strategies and implement clean energy solutions across global supply chains. She is a certified energy manager and has also worked with the Association for Energy Affordability, where she improved energy efficiency in multifamily buildings, particularly within lower income communities in New York. Xixi earned her bachelor's degree in environmental science from Peking University and her master's degree in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is originally from Beijing and now lives in New York City. We're also very lucky to have Professor Ryan join us today. Professor Nicholas Ryan studies energy markets and environmental regulation in developing countries. His research measures how energy use and pollution emissions respond to regulation and market incentives. His work includes empirical studies of the effect of power grid capacity on electricity prices, how firms make decisions about energy efficiency, and how environmental regulation can be designed to best abate pollution at a low social cost. Recent research studies the adoption and pricing of renewable energy in developing countries. Professor Ryan's research has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and USAID, and he's won a prize. He was a prize fellow in economics at Harvard University from 2012, was it?
A while back.
And he received a PhD in economics, also from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So with that, we should kick off the event, and I'm going to turn it over to Sam to ask some questions.
Right, so we're going to start with some broad questions for our speakers. The first one that we have is, what are some unique advantages that the Global South brings to the clean energy transition?
I can start. It's really nice to be here with everyone. Thank you for coming to our session. For the advantages of the emerging market, developing country, I can few areas. First, they are full of renewable energy resources. For example, we can think of Africa. It's the sunny continent. It has 40% of the world's solar potential, but currently only have 2% of the capacity for solar right now. And also think about South America. You can think of a continent with a lot of hydro energy, but actually it's a very windy continent. It has more wind resources than Europe. And also, speaking of geothermal energy, as you question, which country in the world has the largest geothermal resources? Anyone knows?
Kenya?
No? Close?
Is it Argentina?
No. Actually, the country with the largest resource and also largest development right now is the United States. It's the number one. But after United States, the top three is Indonesia and the Philippines and also Turkey. So renewable energy, developing country has a lot of resources. That's number one. And also they have a lot of resources for the materials we need for clean energy. Like the critical mineral materials is highly concentrated in developing countries, like copper, where it's the metal I'm focusing on, because all the clean energy technologies and all the infrastructure that's supporting clean energy needs copper. But copper is highly concentrated, like more than 70% is concentrated in South America. And also DRC in Africa has more than like probably more than 70% as well of cobalt. And also, Indonesia has more than half of nickel in the world. They have those materials, so that's really a big challenge. They can also supply those materials for clean energy, but at the end, they're also the destination for using the clean energy. So how, if the materials leaving the country and then come back as a product, those countries are going to lose the values. So how to keep the value chain within the countries is a big problem. Also, they have advantage in the workforce because for clean energy deployment, you need a lot of workforce. You need people to install, to maintain, to operate the equipment. The developing countries have a large workforce, also very young workforce, relatively lower cost. So that's an advantage. And also the last one, I think, is the most important one related to the young population. It's the developing countries have the largest demand growth. From now until 2030, around 80% of the electricity demand growth, the actual demand, will be in developing country. And I think this is important because this is what investors follow. They follow demand growth because the energy market is growing there. So that's what attracts investors if the conditions are right. For example, for developed countries like the US and Europe, in the past 20 years, since 2000, the demand growth is very flat, almost nothing in the US. And in Europe, it's negative. There's a decline energy use growth. But only in recent maybe 2 years, because of the AI revolution, the US, first time in 2 decades, experienced the electricity demand growth. It's around 2% now. But developing countries has higher demand growth. For example, India has the highest right now. It's around probably 5 to 6%. And then Southeast Asian countries, they have maybe 4 to 5%. That's where the energy market is expected to grow fastest.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah, so brilliant. So I agree with everything that Cece said. I would also add like maybe 2 or 3 advantages of a more sort of economic nature. So one is that the slate of investment, the capital stock for energy production, it's relatively clean in places that are relatively poor today because they have rapidly growing demand. Most of the electricity they're going to generate off in the future. In the United States or places that have operated on the fossil model for a century, there's an enormous amount of inherited capital stock, and that changes the decisions you make today about how to generate. So there's been sort of a slow decay trickle of exit from coal-fired power plants, driven both by the growth of renewables and by natural gas in the US. However, the economics are quite different for, do I shut down my power plant that I've already built versus if I'm building for new growth, what should I build today? And what has happened recently in, say, the last 5 years, even slightly before that, is that the cost of energy production from renewables has fallen well below the cost of fossil generation for new greenfield fossil power plants. So if you're building something new, you're never going to build a fossil plant now, but for reliability and backup purposes. However, if you've built something 50 years ago or 60 years ago, which is often the case for the fossil capacity in the US now, then you might still hang on to it. And so there's an advantage, in a sense, in being a late mover, which is having demand that arose more recently, because you can now invest in this technology that is relatively low cost, and you will invest in a totally different portfolio of generation than you might have done if you'd been deciding 50 years ago. And so that's, relatively speaking, a big advantage from a present and forward-looking point of view. I guess a second economic comparison and advantage of lower and middle income countries relative to sort of higher income countries is, I would say, a comparative advantage in the cost for renewables vis-a-vis fossil fuels. So what do I mean by comparative advantage? Think of the technological difference in what is required to set up at low cost a power plant and with reasonable operating efficiency. Compare, am I going to operate a 500 megawatt coal boiler versus am I going to sort of import some panels and throw them up in a field? The level of technological sophistication, the level of supply chain connectedness and trade for fuel, the level of, say, human and physical capital required for the fossil plant and for that to operate well and efficiently is just worlds beyond what is necessary for the solar solution. And so what you see is countries that have for decades invested and depended on fossil fuel rapidly moving away. Pakistan is a great example of this, where people are leaping off of the grid and leaping off of these poor legacy investments that their government and utilities had made on their behalf at extremely high costs in favor of lower technologies, in some point, either cord cutting or not even joining the grid in the first place. So the comparative advantage, meaning, relative to the fossil alternative, which is much higher priced in low and middle income countries, the advantage of renewables is all the greater because they're relatively easy to set up and operate. They don't depend on supply chains for fossil fuel. And so a lot of the risks attendant to the fossil supply chain, a lot of those sort of mistakes that generated high costs of generation are no longer relevant. And so, for decision makers today, for both of these reasons, there's therefore a sort of strong impetus for renewable energy.
Very nice insights. Thank you. I'll move on to our second question. To what extent do advanced economies and/or multilateral institutions play a role in emerging markets in the global south?
I can start. You mentioned from advanced economy, those funding. I believe you're mentioning that's like international public funding, right? So when we talk about the investment in clean energy, you can basically have roughly 4 categories, like international public funding, domestic public funding, international private investment, and domestic private investment. Actually, this is a good question because WRI just released a report earlier this week. This report is from our system lab, tracking all the 45 indicators for Paris Agreement, because this is the 10th year for Paris Agreement. So we are tracking the indicators for the progress to achieve the goal by 2030. And we found among all the 45 indicators, they're all off track. However, good news is among those indicators, there are some indicators perform better than the other. We made some progress globally. One of those is the investment on clean energy, on energy transition. Actually, especially in the past few years after the pandemic, the needle is moving. For example, roughly the world needs around $2.9 trillion per year until 2050 to do the global energy transition. And now we're close. We're around $2.3 trillion last year, 2024. That's the highest ever, the highest record ever. And it's doubled compared to around probably 2021. So it's really a big breakthrough. It's a lot of progress on this. However, if you look at the number for developing countries, emerging markets covers around 50% of the investment, the energy transition, clean energy. It seems pretty good, right? It's growing. However, if you take China off the chart, take China off the picture, for the rest of the developing countries, emerging market, the share dropped from 50% to 15%. And actually, the investment decreased in the past 4 years, even though the overall picture doubled, but for those countries, it's just decreased. But if you look further, look at Africa, the share dropped from 15 to only 2%. They have 20% of the world population, but they attracted only 2% of the investment. They need probably like 5 or 6 times more to do the transition, but they attract only this little. Even though it's so little, this investment, 70% is covered by actually international public funding. So right now, international public funding is super important for countries, the least developed countries as Africa, because without this amount of money, they couldn't move forward at all. However, the point is not to how to increase the amount of public funding from advanced economy, because the number cannot go up too quickly or too much. I think the World Bank did a research a while ago saying the public funding, domestic or international, can cover probably only no more than 15% of the entire spending we need globally. So for the rest of 85%, it needs to be covered by private investment. So the point is how to use the public funding, especially from international public funding, either like US aid or UK aid or World Bank, how to use this money more effectively, more efficiently to attract the private investment. That's the key for those developing countries. Professor Ryan just mentioned those countries have advantage, a comparative advantage. Also, the cost of renewable energy is dropping. That's true. Around 95% of the regions around the world, clean energy like solar, wind, is cheaper than fossil fuel. However, the point for those developing countries to deploy those technologies quickly, there is a kind of cost. It's super high. That's the barrier for them. That's the cost of capital. The borrowing money, the capital cost is super high in those countries because of high risks, like financial risks, perceived risk, or real risk, like political risk, credit risk. All of those kind of different risks make the borrowing costs for those countries super high. Like could be 2 to 3 times higher. For example, for a utility solar project in Europe or in the US, the interest rate probably 8 to 10%. But in Africa, it could be as high as 25% or higher. So it's so hard for them to borrow money, even though the technology cost is lower, it's dropping. So the question is how those advanced economy can help them to use the public money more efficiently, to leverage more private investment. I think for the advanced economy, it is important not to support money only, but also to do a lot of capacity building, technical assistance for those countries to make the right policy, enabling policy, to have the right risk mitigation instruments, then lower the capital costs. So that's, I think that's to what extent those money can work for.
Yeah, so I totally agree, and I guess I'd make like two points broadly. One is absolutely, if you look at, say, a megawatt of renewable capacity and ask what was the importance of a multilateral institution in getting that megawatt installed, the answer almost everywhere is nil or practically nothing. Like I asked explicitly to government officials in India who are responsible for promoting renewable energy, the people who have the greatest personal incentive to, pound their chest and claim credit. Wow, the renewables are doing great. You're at the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. What have you done to advocate for this? And he said, well, we just got lucky. The panels got so cheap and the thing is taken off. And so now all of these new companies, private companies, Azure Power, Renew Power, even the legacy fossil companies, Adani and Tata and so forth, have entered into the business and they've invested. And so on balance, in China, in India, in large sort of upper, low, middle income countries, the private sector is going to work. But then, the heterogeneity, and which Shishi also noted, is that there's sort of another portion, which is large in terms of population, but which is very small in terms of installed megawatts. I think the striking fact, I'm going to mess up the figure, but she said maybe 2 or 3% of renewable energy installation is in Africa. I believe there's less solar installed in Africa than in Germany, which is not terribly sunny. And so these differences are rising not because of geographic disadvantage, but because of risk and because of a lack of complementary investments, for example, in transmission and other sort of means to distribute. So what has happened in the absence of those investments at the public level is that households have taken things into their own hands because renewable energy scales down very well. And so if you go to most rural parts of Africa, you will see people with solar panels on the roofs. I have a paper with data from all over different countries, and basically the more remote the place, the more likely it is that those households are going to be powered by solar panels. The market share in rural Mali for household solar systems is something like 65%, in a very, very poor part of the world. And so you might say, okay, great, they're getting energy one way or the other. The difficulty is that doesn't provide any of the ability to scale. It doesn't provide any of the ability to start a business or an alternative use. It will charge your mobile phone. It will light your home, make you sort of safe in the evening, but it's not a substitute for the grid. And my personal concern is that the sort of wide diffusion of personal household solar that is like energy autarky for households is going to lead to a lack of pressure on governments to invest and sort of complete the extension of the grid and these sort of reforms or capital market deepening that would be required to get utility scale investments that will be much cheaper. And so basically you're going to end up in this sort of dead end with a passable but relatively more expensive alternative to grid scale renewables.
Wow, this is all such great discussion, and it's so much complexity because even within developing countries, there's many different types, and the access to capital is different. And then what counts as an energy transition is different because just charging your phone is not good enough energy. So, I mean, having discussed how global public finance works, Shishi, this is a question for you, because some of your work is focused on local financial institutions across Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and even within East Africa, all of these countries have a very different local ecosystem for financing. So, what contexts have surprised you, and what lessons do you think carry across borders?
Yeah, before I begin on this question, I want to comment. What you just mentioned actually is exactly what we found through our research. Mm-hmm. And that's actually the reason why we started working with local financial institutions, because we found the big barrier for energy access is the demand, how to scale the demand. For energy access right now in the world, there are more than 650 million people. They have any access to electricity. They have to live with the biomass energy. That does not include that around 1 billion people, they do have energy access, but it's just a couple of hours per day. So for energy access, we found there's big barrier is the demand growth. It's so hard to be scaled. For those households, they got access to electricity with like solar lamp or this kind of device. They got the access, but it stay there. It's hard to grow. And a few years later, they may lose the access because they couldn't pay for those devices because they don't have income increase. So they will lose the access again. That's why the number is always up and down, but it's so hard to make big progress because the demand growth is so hard for them that we found we have to help them to use the little access of electricity to make more income. And then they will use more electricity. That's why we need to scale up beyond those solar lamps with some appliances, for example, solar pumps or solar refrigerators. So they can use those appliances to work in their small business. They can get more income. That's how they grow their access. That's the barrier we found. However, to get there, to find those farmers, it's so hard to use international public funding. Like those small rural farmers, they cannot go to the World Bank to get a loan. This is not possible. So they have to go to their local credit union, local financial institution, local bank to get more small loan to get a solar pump. However, when we did this project, something surprised me most is the scale of those local financial institutions. So in the beginning of the project, we crunched numbers. We look into the public reports of local financial institutions put the number together, we focused on Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. Those 4 East European countries. Relatively, they are more economically more developed than the rest of the Africa countries. However, when we put all the numbers together, we found the total gross loan level from all local financial institutions is around $73 billion. That's a lot of money, but for countries like those size, it's too small. We in the beginning we thought, is that a mistake? Maybe we forgot a zero. So we checked the number again, and the colleague used. She said, oh, this number couldn't be correct because it's too small. Look at Canada. Canada's gross loan level is like 3 trillion. So it's like 41 times bigger than these 4 countries. However, if you see these 4 countries is one country, this East African country, the population is like 11 times of Canada. And you may also argue probably Canada has more GDP, it's advanced economy. But actually, the GDP of Canada is only 4 times of this East African 4 countries together. So it just shows you how left behind, how small the financial market, financial institution is. This is just gross loan. It's even not the capital market. I think International Energy Agency, IEA, once pointed out one of the largest barrier for those developing countries to develop energy transition, clean energy, is their capital market is so left behind. The size is too small as a share of their GDP. I don't have too much data to show, but I think it's totally true because we dig in more for data for these 4 East African countries. We found for the capital market, for example, for their corporate bonds, corporate loans, it's just 1% of their GDP. And for the liquidity of the equity, like stock market turnout rate, is just around 5%. And for developed countries like Europe and the US, probably should be around like 100%, 200%, but they have only 5%. That surprised us, that how left behind their financial capital market is. Then I was thinking, like, should those countries wait until their capital market get there and then they develop those clean energy? Probably it's too late. However, if you think around, it's like a chicken and egg crunch issue. Can they use clean energy as a driver for their local capital market? I don't know, but that's a question for you guys. I think it's possible because if you think about capital markets, I think one of the drivers will be to have more long-term, large-scale infrastructure projects, right? So which sector have more of those projects is energy sector. So I think that's possible, but I don't know the answer. That's the question for you guys, maybe to explore later.
Right. Very interesting to make the point in the more developed or less developed countries. So I'd also like to ask a question to Professor Ryan. So your work has bridged field experiments, market design, and on-the-ground policy collaboration in India's energy sector. So this is building onto what Shishi has said, but based on your experience adapting these frameworks in India, what aspects of Western economic strategies translate effectively to emerging markets, and where do you think the underlying assumptions of these models break down?
So I think the biggest point of tension, but where the sort of models kind of must translate in some sense, is that in all of this that we're talking about in energy, there's a real difference from, say, sneakers or watches or any sort of purely private sector good, in the sense that for utility scale energy, there can be private entry and private capital and private entrepreneurship and innovation, but it's going to always interface with the public grid, because the grid is a natural monopoly, so it's going to be run by one party, usually the government, sometimes privately run, but with heavy government regulation. And so however much innovation there is in technology, there's going to be this point of contact where to get your product to customers, you have to rely on the government for the last mile, even for the transmission sector as well. And so that makes a challenge because in many countries, they're not necessarily tooled up and might not have the institutions for contract enforcement, the traditions from common law to sort of regulate with a long time horizon. So I was describing earlier these coal plants that are very, very slowly trickling away and turning off over the course of decades. And you might say, my goodness, hurry up. Like, get on with it and close down. But if you're really generous, you can think that that's a victory for institutions and for regulation. Why is that a victory that the coal plants are hanging on? They're hanging on because they're sort of regulated, receiving cost of capital for those that invested under a regulatory regime that would reimburse that cost of capital. And because the institutions and the contract enforcement is so strong in the United States, they're able to still get those payments despite that they wouldn't be economically viable today. And so there's a sense in which you need to honor your commitments. Why is that true in clean energy? Because suppose you build a massive power plant in South Africa or in Tanzania, or you build this new geothermal facility to take advantage of the resources on the shores of Lake Victoria. Well, then you need to sell that energy, and you need to sell it by connecting to the public grid. And so you need to be assured that you're going to receive a fair wholesale price, a fair return on your investment. Once you've built that, you can't say, I'm going to generate this geothermal electricity, and, well, I made the plant in Kenya. Actually, the government isn't going to pay me, so I'm going to instead sell it to Germany. No way, no how. You can't put those electrons on a boat. And so the sort of weakness here is you need to move some of the sort of institutional ideas and the commitment and the regulatory capacity, and as well the sort of independence of those institutions to help enforce these contracts. And those are models that have taken decades to develop, and they're not very easy to move, and that's part of what contributes to the risk that we were discussing earlier. And so I think that's an opportunity in the sense that those institutions don't exist. They could be built up, and that's one of the things like WRI and other multilateral institutions can do, which is even though they're not going to be the prime mover in capital, the scale of the capital investment required is just too great, they can be a prime mover in creating institutions that are able to absorb that capital and put it to good use. And that's sort of like leverage. What we mean leverage is not just sort of investing with borrowed money, but actually creating institutions that will give confidence to the private sector to invest.
Wow. Okay, so that has all been really amazing to learn about, but we're going to break into two groups. And the speakers have a case study that's inspired from their experiences, and they're going to walk you through it and ask you for solutions to challenges that they faced. So let's do that now. Maybe you can break through the middle, right and left.
Thank you, everyone, for being so engaged in our case studies. So what we'd like to do right now is invite audience members to kind of share some of the takeaways that they got from their breakout room. And please provide the context, especially for those who weren't able to listen, right? They were in the other study. We can also start with the speakers.
I'm just going to do the same. I'm going to throw it back and say thank you for your engagement, but ask if anyone could just summarize briefly what were some of the themes we discussed. I hope it wasn't too discouraging, as the nature of risk for investment in clean energy, why that might be especially challenging in low and middle income countries, and what are institutional solutions to address that. But we didn't. There's no silver bullet. The punchline is it's a very difficult problem. But if anyone would volunteer to discuss some of the themes we laid out, that would be helpful.
I'll just throw a couple thoughts out, and then others can please correct me. I ask in advance that the risk for renewables and clean energy development across nations is, frankly, as diverse as the countries themselves. And therefore, the solutions kind of have to be as diverse as the countries themselves. And at the end of the day, there is cost to non-performance, and non-performance can come in lots of different ways, and again, with the diversity. And solutions are going to have to be probably on the ground into a company I'm working with. And the alternative to that is paying more. Somebody's going to have to pay more. Please fill in the 90% of blanks, somebody.
I can also pass the mic.
I've never been told I need a mic.
Well, I'm just thinking that the idea of financial innovation and, for instance, has anybody thought, or there are cases where, I'm thinking like in the world of education, in Colombia, where I am from, parents start to make payments to a fund since their kids are 5 years old, and then when they get into college, they have saved a lot and they get back those funds. So aren't they kind of ideas where governments can start kind of paying to a common fund, and then in 5 years or 3 years, whatever the structure of the deal, they get back those funds?
Yeah, so I mean, it's like the idea of like putting up a bond or putting up an escrow. The idea would be, okay, can we get some performance guarantee that will prevent the government from misbehaving and lowering the price or trying to renegotiate a contract and that kind of thing? And that kind of, it seems like it's appealing, but then of course that has an opportunity cost as well. If you put up this escrow fund and you ask a government which is already rather cash-strapped and can't raise much revenue through taxation, okay, put this money aside and we're going to hold that, at a bank in Switzerland, that would not be a very popular proposal. And so even that, it seems like it's cost-free, but you still have the opportunity cost of the capital that they can't use in the meantime. And so it's sort of, someone's going to pay, but it's just paying in another way, which is foregoing the return on that capital or the real investments that you would have made if you had free use of it in the meantime.
Yeah, I'll have a two-prong, I guess a summary of what we did. Kind of did a case study of Indonesia. We were, in terms of, I guess, assisting the government in transitioning into the clean energy. And we had different, I guess, realities of like their energy supply and what are their goals and the stakeholders we have to keep in mind when developing a closed-looped system. So that, I guess, experience was pretty interesting. That was the whole thing. Oh, sure.
We essentially had a competition and we had to pitch ideas, and I think the four general themes that came up were kind of using the government to motivate the population and kind of give detractors the confidence to believe in the longer term aim. That could be, for the only closed loop we really got was sort of starting with jobs, increasing production, letting that production be felt in the community, and then the taxes that are then generated then go back to the government. So that's the example of the closed loop. We then had kind of more thematic approaches. So there was a group that thought about multilateral approaches, companies like H&M or Walmart that are using Indonesia as a resource, kind of having them be ethically responsible and be the ones to shoulder where they're benefiting from. We had a group think of supply chains in the longer term. So instead of running away from all the challenges of these kind of more expensive, expensively commercialized systems, kind of meeting that reality head on and realizing that even if we're aiming for 2060 or 2070 aim, the money will be spent anyway. So would we rather spend money 3 times doing 3 different things in the short term, or just use all of that capital to invest in something that might be expensive but longer term more stable? And then we finally had a diversified approach, and that's, I guess, the opposite, and actually doing what we can in the short term across different resources to meet our goals. And it could be, I can't remember exact examples, if you want to.
Sure. I think you explained it really well. Oh, let's not break the mic. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think the alternative approach that you were alluding to, that our group was talking about, is like, when you're thinking about decarbonizing, it is a layered approach, which is how I described it before, where, I mean, is it the right decision to just put all your eggs in the geothermal basket, for example, to be like, this is a firm baseload power resource that Indonesia has a lot of, that the case study country, that Indonesia has a lot of, or should we be trying to diversify in order to decrease the need for build out of a resource that, even though it's abundant, is fairly expensive and will take a long time to develop? And I think our group was talking about layering those approaches, pairing with solar and storage. If you can find a way of using biomass in a way that's still contributing to decarbonization, if the goal that you're prioritizing is let's try and decarbonize the energy sector as quickly as possible, in our view, if I may speak for all three of us, it was to try and throw as much into the mix as you could in a reasonable way, so that you're not you're chipping away at the need for very expensive projects. But I think something that I raised my hand to say was that it was interesting to get such a big problem as the case study problem, because I feel like often when I'm presented with these kinds of hypotheticals, it's like, think about the vehicle sector, or like, think about the vehicle sector in this way, or something like that. Whereas, I mean, to be confronted with the entire manufacturing sector and the diversity of approaches reveals, how difficult it is to walk and chew gum at the same time in the development space, and that there are a lot of different tacks you can take, and how do you prioritize one over the other when all of them sound like they'd be pretty impactful and helpful. Does anyone else want this?
Maybe you want to speak. You want to say something?
No.
Okay.
Well, I had a question, but
Five different perspectives, different solutions, covering like government leading the market transformation with lower the risk, and also with supply chain to build more capacity of the supply chain to lower the cost of new technology. And we also have like idea to bring in international big players to let them to play a role to de-risk. And we do have a solution to diversify the clean energy sources to lower the emission factor of the grid. And we also have an out-of-box solution at Team 5. They scratch all the existing solutions, thinking, no, we want to develop nuclear. So very diverse solution. Every team has their own perspective, and we have an open voting. All solutions seems catalytic and impactful. So it's really impressive.
Had a question.
yeah, I had a question. I guess it was earlier when we were speaking about like models for like developing country. I guess real recent case study. I'm from Jamaica, and Jamaica recently had like the worst hurricane in that aspect. In terms of like the markets, like stock markets and stuff, it was really good in terms of like what existed. They previously set up the catastrophe bond prior to like this hurricane, like everything in terms of like investments into like clean energy, and like they had like a vision 2030 for that transition. But when a hurricane in preliminary estimates gets rid of 35% of your GDP, what can you do? So I guess not like I'm saying do you have an answer to this, but like in terms of like adoption technologies, or like even like those models that go face to face with like these freak disasters, which unfortunately will become more and more present. So even in the cases where the developing countries are doing the right thing, what can they do to like sustain that development in the clean tech transition?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that, but one thing quick share is what we have learned in Africa. So those African countries, the policymakers, through research we found those policymakers, one of the largest difficulty for them to plan energy transition is they don't have modeling, they don't have quantitative evidence for them to make decisions. So they said, if we don't have scenarios, how can we transit? So in their scenarios, usually in their modeling, they have to consider energy projection, demand, also economic development projection. Nowadays, a very important factor for them to model into their scenario is the disaster, the risk factor. So they have to bring all those factors together to bring scenarios for those policymakers to make better decisions. That's a big gap we found through our work. Currently, those developing country decision makers, policy makers, they do not have modeling work scenarios to support their decisions. So yeah, that's just want to share what we have learned from our work.
Yeah.
Thank you for the very insightful exercise. My question was around, it was quite evident that honoring the agreement goes a long way in like building trust and then maybe potentially bringing in more investments. I was curious to know if like within countries in Africa or maybe within states in India, if trust has been or like honor has been like a differentiating factor in really bringing long-term investments. And then like when you do a study, how do you isolate that effect of like given all other conditions like infrastructure not being laid out or other political aspects being the same, like when a state or when a country honors its agreements, has that sort of, is there any examples of countries that have that honor being a differentiator in like economic growth or?
So I mean, I think every like large investor in the energy space has their own dedicated risk teams, as well as availing services from international risk consultancies and parties whose job it is to try to understand if we invest in this context, what is the likelihood that agreement is going to be honored. So in that sense, this idea passes the market test. Like I, as a researcher, also described that I have ways econometrically of trying to measure or to isolate the effect of risk, and I find that to be important within India. But then you can also like read the Wall Street Journal or read The Economist, and what you see is that there are a lot of countries that have kind of meddled in the energy sector to different degrees and got burned. So a famous example is Eskom in South Africa, which could be a sort of leader for Africa in renewable energy, does have a lot of investment, but Eskom, which is their public utility, is basically a basket case and has repeatedly defaulted on past contracts. And now it's very difficult to get private parties that are willing to invest and sell to them. Similarly, like the government of Mexico, had liberalized their energy sector to an extent, and then more recently kind of renationalized large parts of it, and so that creates this risk for any investor in the entire country, which is sort of existential. So in a given case, it's hard to quantify which extent of the higher prices is due to this counterparty risk versus other factors, but I think everybody who's making these decisions would agree that it's one of the prime forces entering into their consideration.
Okay, wow, this has been a really great workshop. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We're going to wrap up, and I'm so glad that we covered so many things, from the advantages that the Global South, which is a term I don't like, has, and also like transforming a textiles industry or just building trust with institutions. I'm going to ask both of you for any closing remarks that you have for all of us here, and then we can go.
I would only say briefly, I think this sector is kind of the work of a lifetime, and it's really like something, the generational change hasn't happened for 2-3 generations, and it's just starting out. It seems now that there's been so much progress, but it's not really caught up with where the technology is, and so these issues are all going to continue to be important for decades to come, for your whole careers.
What I want to share is, as Nick just mentioned, it's changing really fast, very dynamic, and it's really fun to work in this sector, in this field. I didn't have enough time to share more cases with you guys, but I guarantee you that this is a very dynamic field, very fun, changing so fast. You have so many things to learn, and a lot of things. The needle is moving. A lot of things to watch out in years.
Thank you.
Well, can you all join me in thanking our speakers?